As we gather together from across this land, we acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which we stand, study, work and play. We pay respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, and to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who may be present this evening. Please be seated. My name is Professor Peter Sherlock, and it's my great honour to be the Vice-Chancellor of the University of Divinity and to welcome you to this inaugural professorial lecture this evening or this morning, depending on where you are. Welcome to those with us here at St Paschal's Chapel in Box Hill in Melbourne, Australia, and those joining us online from all around the world. A special welcome to family and friends of René, including his children Christian, Marika, Ariana, Rose, and René and Christa's parents, who are all joining us online from their homes in the Netherlands. It's great to have you with us. Professor René Erwich was appointed Principal of Whitley College in 2017 after working as a research professor in practical theology in the Netherlands for a number of years. His focus in teaching and research is always on the intersection of faith, religious practices and society. The driving motivation behind his work in preaching, teaching and writing is around creating connections and integration of the realities of today's world with the realities of the gospel of the kingdom. He is highly interested in new forms of church, theology and media, human sexuality in theology, and supervised learning. René is an ordained Baptist minister and a registered pastoral supervisor. On the 31st of October 2019, what feels an immeasurable length of time ago, the Council of the University appointed René as a professor of the university. This followed a lengthy and highly scrutinising application process, which René passed with flying colours. Becoming a professor is a great moment in anybody's life. I still have I have sad to say, the Qantas frequent flyer envelope with the word professor before my name for the first time. It's an exciting moment, not only as a personal honour, but particularly as a recognition of the things that we value in the mission of higher education, in research, in teaching, and as I've just said, in this case, in that intersection of faith, religious practice and society. So we join here tonight not only to honour René, but also to honour his contribution to research, to leadership in the academy, to engagement with the churches and community, and all that that means for us and for the world around us. René's contributions to theological scholarship, research and leadership are great gifts to the University of Divinity and to Whitley College and the societies that we serve. This professorial appointment recognises his sustained commitment to engagement with the issues of the contemporary world, and as such, René embodies and exemplifies the university's vision. I very much look forward to the continued contribution in leadership, in strategic thinking and in theological reflection that Professor Erwich will provide in and well beyond the University of Divinity, especially in applied and collaborative research. Finally, I note we had hoped to run this event in May this year, but due to the global pandemic, we're forced to postpone it. And it is a great delight that we are finally able to gather here, though small in number, on site, and for those of you who are Melburnians, without face masks. But as we gather, we are conscious of the cost the pandemic is taking around the world, and we continue to offer our prayers for healing and for good decisions in the world around us, and particularly for those of us who may be in lockdown who are joining us online. We know what that's like. So without further ado, it is my great delight to invite René Erwich to present his inaugural professorial lecture, Practical Theology as a Practice of Hope. René.
Chancellor, Vice-Chancellor, members of the University of Divinity Council, college principals, here present, but also listening in and watching this ceremony, members of the Whitley College Council, esteemed Whitley College faculty, members of the Baptist Union of Victoria Council, colleagues of the Baptist Union, family and friends. It is a great honor to stand here today in front of you and to present my inaugural lecture as Professor of Practical Theology. Let me share with you a personal journey, first of all. Much of our theologies is shaped in a close relationship with our biographies. And this is true for me. I grew up in a Christian family with my grandfather as my role model in spiritual life. He was a part-time minister of a small local evangelical congregation, and I sat front row as a little boy, listening to his somewhat pietistic sermons. One morning at his home, I think I must have been 9 years young, he showed me a painting of a wonderful sunset. Using it to deliver a talk on the future of the world, heavy theme for that age, he outlined his belief the day would come when all things would be made new and God would be all in all. The God of hope would be all in all. And I remember the impact of that morning. It was huge. It was this experience that planted a little seed in my heart and mind. Hope is something profound. Hope as a gift that shapes and forms the very quality of our lives itself. Ever since, the theme of hope has been part of my own journey, meaningful to my own faith, woven into my own sense of calling in ministry. The experience of hope is so fundamental to me, but I cannot close my eyes for the ambivalence that connects so easily to the experience of hope for so many in our world today. George Frederick Watts' painting, and you can see it on the little booklet that was on your chairs, or even some probably behind me. George Frederick Watts' painting, Hope, touched me with this ambivalence in mind. It depicts hope blinded and seated on a globe, playing an instrument like a lyre, possibly, with only one string unbroken. Hope bends her head as she listens to music. Does it convey a sense of desolation, despair, and melancholy, rather than a future orientation towards a flourishing life? Or is it what's personal desolation after the death of his adopted daughter we see here? Who knows? Is she blindfolded, yet seeing with her heart, touching a string of hope maybe? What could have easily painted this in 2020? A symbol of our contemporary despair with the impact of a pandemic, bushfires, global anxiety, loss and grief. And whatever the ambivalences around hope, we need it more than ever. We need to be able to stretch our arms out to someone, to something, someone that we long for. Hope is what makes us human. Now, let me just embark on that journey a bit more with you as we look at, let's say, that nature of hope. And I invite you on that journey because I think it will gradually be clear that unfolding that narrative of hope and its theological core and its implications for practical theology, it also kind of gets into two separate, almost like narratives and practices that we could develop as hopeful practices. Christian hope is of an eccentric nature, even though hope looks like sometimes like a characteristic of human nature. Well, I agree with Kelsey that we need to perceive hope as a gift that comes towards us from the outside. Hope is the deposit of a future, of the future, a vulnerable part of eternal life, yet to be fully received and embraced. It's not a psychological competency that we can develop. The possibility of hope is embedded in the reality of God, keeping his promises and drawing his creation into his future by his endless love. Yet, according to Kelsey, we live on borrowed time as we hope. Hope is a gift that cannot be manipulated, even if we try so. It does not entail an evasion or denial of brokenness at all, death and pain. And hope, I've learned, can even be present in circumstances that appear totally devoid of a possibility for anything approximating God's future rule. Now, I believe that this articulation of hope as flourishing on borrowed time is present both in the Hebrew Bible, as some of you would know, and possibly also in the New Testament, maybe even more. And I've chosen to focus briefly on a text from the 3rd chapter of the letter of 1 Peter. And I take that little phrase from the 3rd chapter as my starting point. 15, verse 15 and 16, it reads like, "But in your hearts revere Christ as Lord. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. But do this with gentleness and respect, keeping a clear conscience, so that those who speak maliciously against you, your good behavior in Christ, may be ashamed of their slander." This letter, the letter of 1 Peter, takes us back into the situation of the Christians living in Asia Minor. And Feldmeyer and others have claimed that the context of suffering of the Christians addressed in this letter mainly consists in problems stemming from the hostility towards the Christian community by a pagan society. At the root of the hostility lies the incompatibility of the exclusive worship of the God of Israel with a sacredly based ancient society. If the state and its structures are meant to be seen as sacred, this was a no-go zone for this young Christian community. It rejected participation in a number of general public and social activities because it would otherwise mean that being confronted with pagan realities at every corner. So the level of exclusivity they lived from was hard to understand for the ancient mind. Feldmeyer, I quote, "In a word, Christians had consciously placed themselves outside the religiously determined life context and had become foreign to it." End of quote. This rejection should not be interpreted as a total negation of the world, but it is the consequence of belonging to God, which is emphasized throughout the whole letter. They belong to this new society without ending in a dualistic approach to reality or rejecting it. So their conversion and their conversion experience led them into a different realm, the rule of God in Christ, and therefore they are urged to live good lives as foreigners and exiles. The experienced suffering is not a sign of being abandoned by God, but a sign of belonging to Him. And the audience is therefore urged to contrast the ever-present fear with the ever more present hope that resides in them. The presence of Christ, may that be a summary, is a deposit of divine presence in the midst of their difficult circumstances and gives them the strength to share their lives filled with hope, with gentleness and respect. They are called to readiness for dialogue about the hope that is in them as a guiding principle of the new life. For me, this shapes the core of what a Christian narrative could look like. Now, again, and I kind of tend to go back in circles a bit maybe, but it's necessary. While this hopeful core is needed, there are other voices, again, that need to be listened to. And I take two examples, one from a systematic theologian, as that I think I believe is a good exercise, not to stay just in your own discipline sometimes, but make little excursions into some others. And Kerkinen, as a systematic theologian, is one of them. And Polkinghorne, maybe not surprisingly, a theoretical physicist, is another. To start with Kerkinen, in Hope and Community, he draws our attention towards the possibility and the conditions for a Christian eschatology, teaching of the last things and the end time. And for him, a viable, constructive eschatology needs to be conditioned by the extent to which it takes into account the various dimensions and spheres of life. Crucial is the more complex thinking about the general human and cosmic destiny, which affects us all. He therefore builds his own discourse strongly on recent work in the area of what is called physical eschatology. In summary, and very straightforward, it means decay and annihilation. That's not a nice message for tonight when we talk about hope. But in summary, here again, we are looking at the sun changing into a red giant, engulfing the orbits of the Earth. Our galaxy will have ended in 40 to 50 billion years. Massive stars will have become black holes. A closed universe will have grown to its maximum size and will probably collapse. Sorry. And as a result, all carbon-based life forms will have been destroyed. Not really hopeful, I would argue. Now, Polkinghorne in a similar way elaborates a bit, but he looks at let's say, the very different scientific responses to this dark place, because of course you can look at that from different angles. Scientists tend to have different positions, as we all know. So here are a few. Some would see human life and existence as just a period of transition, like a 3-minute period compared to the rest of the stuff. That's not a lot, 3 minutes. Others adhere to the so-called total view, in which meaning is to be found in some kind of atemporal life, leading to a static preservation of what life has been, without any hope for completion and fulfillment of life. Or physical eschatology, that focuses on the survival of intellectual life beyond the destruction of our planet and sees all kinds of very amazing opportunities for re-engineering embodiment, artificial, all kinds of stuff. And the fourth and final one would address the so-called endless fertility option, or response, referring to a kind of constant bubbling up of new baby universes. I don't know whether that is helpful. The big question, and that's why I address it here tonight, the big question is, of course, how does this communicate meaning and hope? Does it? It's not a rhetorical question, it's a question that needs to be addressed, it needs to be answered to a certain degree. Kerkinen contends that most of these responses are of a highly speculative nature, lacking, of course, a high level of consensus. Even more problematic is the extent to which these responses are unable to converse with, let's say, later philosophical and theological questions people have. And finally, the extent to which they could quickly lead to a lack of responsibility for taking care of the planet, as if that would not be our responsibility. I'm not interested in developing a theology of science, and I'm not going to do that. But of course, I can't see things separate. They all kind of get together. You can't just step away as if it's not there. So there is a sense and there is a longing, at least in my view, for integration. There's a need for a deep dialogue. Now, one of the people that has been doing that is someone like McLeish and many others, but McLeish especially. They have pleaded to move beyond that kind of hostile perception of the relationship between faith and science, actually by reframing the connections between faith and science. Instead of playing them off against each other, it might be helpful to reread and reinterpret a multitude of texts like Psalm 33 or Romans 8. Very special text to reinterpret in that light. And that might help us to reopen a new hermeneutic for understanding the created order. I quote McLeish. So a theology of science for me is, with all this rich biblical material throughout Scripture in mind, the story of making friends again with creation. That's a wonderful. I like that. I like that idea, making friends with creation again. And it involves, once you embark on that, a reframing of science as well, into becoming a supporter of healing our relationship with nature. A vision of hope needs to include the impact of salvation on human life. That needs to be clear, a concern to theology, and indeed it should be a concern. We need a vision of hope in which the ongoing invitation to participate in God's communion of love is shared and lived out to the full, as Rublev's famous icon reveals. God's ongoing invitation is exactly what leads to an experience where faith, hope, and love are woven into a new life-giving fabric that enables people to act in hope and act with hope. So that icon reveals much more than just a string of hope compared to George Frederick Watt's painting. In my view, the icon is an icon of hope, shaping a potential flourishing life, a life lived in hope, and with the experience of God's goodness and steadfast love. Hope is not blindfolded, unaware of the impact of participating in God's presence, but embraced and safeguarded in the midst of darkness and injustice. Now, this particular connection with the Trinitarian God conveys a sense of hope for the future. And sharing at this table of communion strengthens the human desire for justice and peace in an ultimate way. That's where the eccentric character of communion kind of reaches out to people. Because the divine love is not enclosed within itself, but seeks to be shared with all those who are open to receive it. Just enough about that. Let's move to practical theology. To me, what I've just said is a major narrative that I would like to hold strong and closely to what I'm going to say further on theology and on practical theology. But let's talk theology a bit first. I gave this lecture, the subtitle, Reflections on a Discipline That Connects. And I contend with Miroslav Volf that at the heart of any good theology lies not simply a plausible intellectual vision, you could think that, but more importantly, a compelling account of a way of life. Theology needs to be about the connections with real life. It's not an opposition to real life. And that's exactly what others like David Ford, for example, have called theology's search for wisdom. Ford relates the core of Christian theology directly to the passion and desire for wisdom and practice of crying out in the street. The big concern for theology is how to shape a life of wisdom, discerning the cries on the streets, understanding the pain, wonder, suffering, hope, grief, joy, and despair, and connect those to the realities of the reign of God. I'm very much inspired by reading the work of the Czech psychologist and theologian Tomáš Halík. And he has elaborated in many of his works on, let's say, the nature of theology. And he kind of compares that with the inner logic of prayer. Prayer makes, in his view, the movement of identification with the wounds of the world And only in doing so it will be possible to develop a vital theology. A vital theology is a theology that cannot say hard things with dry eyes. There is no heart in such theology. Luke 17, verse 5 and 6, starting with the disciples' request to increase their faith, is, according to Halleck, is not about developing a strong faith. It's not. It's a warning against the kind of faith that is so powerful and so loaded with fantasies about omnipotence that it can only destroy what is vulnerable. So the opposite needs to happen. This small seed leads us to the kingdom of the impossible. What is impossible for humankind is possible for God. For God is in places where a different logic counts. And that's why theology is meant to function as a deep logic of hope and prayer. That is the movement that bridges this towards our own lived realities. Halleck has only one concern, and I share that with him, that our own small lives really speak about God, the God who is our ultimate love and hope. That's the kind of theology that I would like to see informing my practical theology. And I share that with Bonnie Miller-McLemore, drawing her attention and her focus to what lies at the heart of practical theology. She says, and I quote, "Ultimately, practical theology is normatively and eschatologically oriented." That is, it not only describes how people live as people of faith in communities and society, but it also considers how they might do so more fully, both in and beyond this life and world. It is about, practical theology is about making a difference in today's world. And you can use it in very different ways as a theological subdiscipline, as the daily theological reflection and activity of believers, as a set of educational theological curricula and programs, or as a method for studying in theology and practice. But crucial is, much more than that, crucial is the position of practical theology at the intersection of society, church, and academy. And I'm sympathetic to the view that much of what practical theology looks like in practice depends on the way we position practical theology. What is the point of orientation here? For many scholars, practical theology is a theory of ecclesial practice, built on normative biblical theological principles, Stadelman, for example. For others, it's a more nuanced position, and that's where practical theology should be oriented towards divine action, aiming at the integration of the gospel experience, people like Andrew Root. Others, and I feel much more comfortable with that, like Miller-McLemore, contend that only the living human experience can be a serious and valid starting point for a practical theological discourse. Clearly, the big question, the central question is what should be given priority in a mutual critical conversation between human experience, empirical, descriptive, practice, local knowledge on one hand, and theological tradition or normative systematic theology on the other. And you could tell answers are many. There are many answers to give. At its best, both extreme positions are held in delicate balance based on a principle of polarity. I can't say much more about that in this context. If I turn my camera a bit to Australia more, now I can see that there are a lot of things happening in the realm of practical theology. And I think it's good to mention some of that because it's important to honor all the things that have been done over the many years. I'll start with Gerald Hall, who addresses a number of phases in that development of practical theology's movement or growth in Australia and Oceania, if I am correctly about that background. And he kind of refers us back to 15 years ago to the 2005 conference of the International Academy of Practical Theology, IAPT, which I'm a member, in Brisbane. And that conference marked an interesting turning point in its focus on the theme, Dreaming the Land, Theologies of Resistance and Hope. And I found that very intriguing because exactly that is in the middle of our conversation tonight. Dreaming and land are central concepts in the hearts and lives of First Peoples, of Aboriginal people here in Australia. These concepts are connected with creative life-giving forces and with the sacred spaces that are so crucial. While colonial history does not fully acknowledge that to the extent that we would hope, there are signs of hope, both in reconciliation with First Peoples, but also in restoration of Aboriginal rights. Of course, this work is far from done, and we can only hope for more. But it's therefore crucial to see how Daniel Lau, South African theologian, adds the perspective of the healing of the land. Besides the healing of the soul, with all that emphasis the churches have put on that, and we still do that, and we still need to do that, there is that other emphasis on healing of the land, cura terrae. The land is not just a spiritual issue. Land is an epitome for Lebensraum, living space, a space for human living, governed by the principles of justice, hospitality, and integrity. Therefore, soul care needs to be supplemented with land care. The church needs to become sensitive to related issues of being lost, displaced, homeless, dislocated, and poor. Thinking about this necessity of land care, I think, and I believe it urges practical theology into a double practice of hope. Care for those who have been dislocated and care for the land in a humble attempt to make friends with creation by acting against the exploitation of it. A necessary exercise indeed, as it questions the self-evident value and power of white, racialized practical theology that refuses to be open to self-critique and review its deeply embedded roots and assumptions. Now let me continue in sharing two practices that are close to my own work. The first is related to shaping hopeful communities, churches, communities of hope. As you may know, my interest in practical theological reflection on the church originates in my own doctoral work, and that was on the relationship between biography, narrative, pastoral care, and levels of engagement in congregational practice. In a church context that was increasingly characterized by decreasing membership and marginalization, large-scale experiments with a variety of change strategies were implemented to turn the tide. Most of those strategies and programs were developed from a missional perspective, and they tried to kind of put the plausibility structures back into those churches that were gradually eroded. These developments were more deeply embedded in a broader cultural shift that took place during the 80s and the 90s of the last century. Scholars like Helen Morris, elaborate on this shift, and she uses in a particular way the term recontextual church, referring to churches, communities, and even theologians who are rethinking the character, form, and role of the church in the light of and as a response to deep cultural changes. Now, they are not so much interested in cosmetic changes, but they are searching to identify fresh ways of being church. This recontextual church is a collection of attempts to reconnect the church in general to cultural changes, revamp its language, message, outreach to people. Its main purpose is to urge the Western Church to re-embed itself in its Christ-centered foundations while innovatively embodying their message in a contemporary context. So you can tell it's about renewed embodiment. And she shows how this movement has arisen in an ever-mutating context of societal, political, and religious changes, and with a wide variety, a wide range of other people and movements contributing to it. Pentecostalism, to a certain degree, to a great degree maybe, the charismatic movement, social gospel, house church movements, etc. And she includes a wide range of representatives, further like the missional church, emerging missional church. I could go on for a while. While I agree with this analysis, it seems that the entire discourse on the shape of church has yet again many challenges in the current context. Morris represents 7 areas of unresolved tensions and interprets those as setting the agenda for further ecclesiological thinking in conjunction with the Pauline concept, church as the body of Christ. I mentioned a few of those tensions, those unresolved tensions. For example, the relationship between the nature of God and the church, or human identity, spirituality, or the relationship between contemporary church and tradition, or the connection between church and culture. All of those are all the time like on the edge of being in that realm of unresolved tensions, dialectical tensions even. I sympathize very much with that analysis, but at the same time, it takes us back to a warning that we had quite a few years ago from Nicholas Healy. And it was kind of a complaint that too much of the ecclesiological thinking is too abstract and idealistic, and that therefore more space should be given to theological forms of cultural analysis, labeling it as ecclesiological ethnography. This ethnographic turn presents itself in the well-known ecclesiology and ethnography network, and its focus on studying the church in its situatedness, using qualitative methodology and methods to connect social, cultural, and theological analysis. Of course, as you would watch that movement grow, you would see further refinements. And someone like Scott Hackley, for example, touches on the importance of placemaking as an important way forward to connect congregational identity on one side with the neighborhood in which churches are embedded. But for him, for Hackley, this whole ecclesiological ethnography and the turn towards that movement is much more, there is much more at stake. It should be much more normative. In other words, for him, contextualization should look like ethnographic fieldwork. It should be a placed performance of identity constructing work, of identity construction of contextual theology. I quote him when he says, "Thus, fieldwork is a means of joining or of facilitating a relational space through an intentional, immersed plunge into ministry context, helping the congregation to situate itself among the various places of the neighborhood, shaping, by doing that, a renewed contextual identity." Its text is not a document, but rather the collaborative performance with one's neighbors and neighborhood. This performance is made possible by joining the rhythms, postures, and disciplines of a people and a place. I think some of the examples the Baptist Union is trying to work on is really closely related to what is described here. Claire Watkins, among many other scholars, reflects along similar lines, trying to develop a specific ecclesiology based on theological action research. And I can't dive too deeply into that tonight as well, but the constant challenge is this: it's to combine thorough academic theological reflection with deep listening to the realities of faith and locate practice and theology at the same time. And this is exactly my question here. What counts as theology in studying the church? There are not a lot of answers, good answers to that. But the result of the attentiveness to the practice as a bearer of ecclesiology in Watkins' project is intriguing, as she pinpoints increasingly three key ingredients of this closed ecclesiology: edgelessness, spirit-trusting fragility, and a serious call to discernment. I'll leave that for another time to embark on that, unfolding that, unpacking that a bit more. When we look at current explorations in the realm of ecclesiology and church, study of the church, the question is how practical theology can contribute to shaping practices of hope. And I believe that it is even more pressing in this current context, as we are not allowed, at least not in many places, to gather in the way we did for so many years. Churches have not been able to gather for a long time. And I myself, we have been witnessing a church service for the first time yesterday again, and just being part of a small group of people that were allowed to be at a local Baptist church. There is a need for serious research and discernment. In a large-scale project I'm involved in called CONTOC, Churches Online in Times of Corona, an impressive group of practical theological scholars have embarked on studying the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on a broad range of services of the church. And it's clear that already massive changes, major changes have taken place. It's estimated that only 30% of the, let's say, membership, maybe even more, will not return to the situation prior to the COVID-19 pandemic. These shifts are part, I believe, not just of the COVID realities, but these are part of a larger meta shift. We find ourselves in the midst of a receding Christianity that signals what originally belonged to the core business is now no longer part of its core competencies. In my own words, there is a selling out. There is a sale of the religious products of the church, and they are being circulated by other providers, not no longer just by the church. So the religious marketplace has grown immensely in that sense. This phenomenon, also known, at least in certain forms, as liquefaction, is cause for deeper reflection also in Australia. Wherever this liquefying movement, manifestation happens, it's a kind of a current phase of modernization where everything is almost like characterized by movement. New communities are more developed as communicative projects rather than as structures. So it's of course of a highly experimental nature, but it has a positive attitude towards postmodern culture and is assessed very differently. So liquid church, it's not a new term. It's kind of opposed with solid church. And there are lots of changes happening there. One of my colleagues, Dutch theologian Kees de Groot, referring to his own Katholica, his own Catholic church, has elaborated extensively on this basic thesis of liquefaction. And he contends that we are not just facing liquefaction of institutional religion, but in fact a more serious problem. Religion and church are crossing boundaries, as I just said. There is a sale going on. There is a redistribution of ecclesial products, if you would like to use that term. I'm sympathetic to his view, though I may be not that negative, but that may be because I'm not Catholic. I don't know. That may be a risk to say that, but in this context, I think it's true. So wherever you look, wherever you are, there is a context in which that liquefaction is clearly taking place. Statistics regarding religion and shifts in religious affiliation are telling, also in Australia and even in Victoria. In addition, also that's not a secret, Australia struggles with its identity and with its sense of being a nation. And in this case, I would like to refer to Hugh Mackay with his work on assessing, let's say, not just the religious state of Australia, but also the context in which churches find themselves. Narratives of fear have deep roots, and narratives of fear and an anxious society may also have taken hostage politicians, healthcare, and maybe even the public domain. According to Mackay, Australia needs the courage to face the realities of education, politics, economics, social cohesion, gender, environment, and certainly religion. And his conclusion is that we need a much more reflective society, a society that learns how to decolonize her own intellectual framework. And probably I'm not saying anything new, but it's still high on the agenda. Let me move on to the last part of my lecture, which is related to another, not so much a topic, but a theme that is very close to my own heart and my own scholarly work. And that is on sexuality, gender, and theology. And the reason that I am involved in that is not because I have traumatic experiences. The reason that I'm involved in it because I have witnessed so many people, and I've shared so many stories and heard so many stories from people who struggled with really shaping their own hopeful lives or shaping their hopeful relationships and experiencing human dignity. Increasingly in my own local church ministry, the question became this: how can we hold our thinking about God, theology, and human sexuality and gender together? Is it possible at all to have a theological voice that supports a hopeful and balanced discourse regarding human sexuality? And how would that theology of sexuality and gender contribute to human dignity? What is needed? What kind of language do we need to develop? Multiple pastoral encounters, and I need to be honest about that, were very complex, very difficult. Meeting with people struggling with the complexities of their own gender, expressions of sexuality, premarital issues, virginity, polyamory, prostitution, abuse, transgender, homosexuality, and intersex were complex and very often led to a lack of support or even, in some ways, marginalization. And to be honest, the church is not the only place where we witness this struggle. So I'm not claiming that the church is a problem per se. But there is a level of confusion in and outside Christian churches and Christian circles, and that is massive. Right in the middle of 2019 upheaval about the Nashville Statement, originating from the US-based Council on Biblical Manhood and Womanhood, Helene Zorgdrager, a Dutch systematic theologian, gave a public lecture with the title Between the Song of Songs and Me Too. And she positioned the current public theological discourse regarding sexuality on a continuum between Song of Songs and Me Too. Between the beauty and the goodness of human sexuality on one hand, and the abhorrent images of it in the abuse of so many women, men, and children on the other. And the question is, how can church and theology move in this minefield and contribute to human dignity and hopeful living? Zorgdrager identifies 4 major trends that directly impact this discourse. The first trend is the tendency to define sexuality as a consumption article. It's not that difficult to see. Love and sexuality happen in a context of dating apps like Tinder and many others. The online realities change the shape of relationships. It's all about the market value. A large number of teenagers and adolescents find their partner through some kind of online app. We had a hilarious conversation with our own children about that. The second trend Zorgdrager identifies is around the shaping of love and intimacy in different models of relationship and testing them in terms of independence and autonomy. While we see an ever-increasing number of marriages and an increasing level of registered partnerships, the majority of first children are born outside marriages. That's just a reality. The third trend relates to the impact of the sexual revolution. Zorgdrager contends that the heritage of that revolution has not been digested well enough. There is something serious going on regarding sexual freedom and resistance against religion. We are aware of the patronizing impact of religion on human sexuality, but one now wonders where the ethical framework is that guides healthy sexual engagement. And the fourth and final trend is the new sensitivity regarding connections between power and sexual violence. And I'm referring here to the Australian Royal Commission into institutional responses to child sexual abuse. And in broader terms, to sexual abuse in media, abuse of minors, abuse in sport clubs, as this has once more shown the linkages between power, positions of authority, sometimes also religious ideology and sexual misconduct. And let's not forget the increasing violence, domestic violence against women. It is within this context of trends that we need a timely response, an attempt to kind of connect personal narratives to a larger discourse, the narratives and the voices of science in their relationship with theology. Let me continue briefly with a short imaginary story that could almost be a story from a pastoral practice, since that is where it all begins. It's a story of a lovely young couple named Julia and Thomas. They love each other deeply and have a strong desire to have children of their own. After some time, they share with their pastor that Julia is expecting. She's pregnant. It's close to the summer holidays when the pastor receives an alarming phone call from Thomas. The baby has arrived. Is everything all right? The pastor asks. Well, no, Thomas says, and he is silent again. What is wrong? The pastor asks. We expected a girl, but we are not sure it is a girl. So now we can't give it a name. Why? Does he ask. Well, it does not look like a girl. The baby has no penis. But it's also not clear whether there is a vagina. The pastor hears the confusion and the shock. And a few weeks later, there is still no name and there is pressure from the family. And Thomas shares, how can we raise this child without a name? What lies ahead for our child? There are many more lenses to look at this story than I can present today. But let me try to give you a few and share a few possible options to look at this story. And it may be not only just an imaginary story. First of all, the condition that the baby is born with has a name. In medical science, it's called an intersex condition. Literature shows how the diagnosis of this condition shifted gradually from disorder to sex variation or variations in sex development. The term itself seems to be an umbrella term with a range of conditions as a result of the genetic and hormonal variations. In medical terminology, the newborn baby did show an atypical genital anatomy. It could not be identified as a boy or as a girl. So a decision for surgery could have been made in combination with long-term medical treatment to develop a clearer sex, paralleled with gender-specific education as a boy or a girl. But very often these stories, that's where the problem comes in, very often these stories are accompanied by a lengthy denial of a person's identity by family, out of shame, but also by strong emotions around the contradictions of the personal body. In practice, this has meant that people with this intersex condition try to forget that there was something different about their bodies. This unknowing, this mechanism of unknowing develops itself within a context of mechanisms of a knowledge asymmetry and specific worldviews in which sexuality is then regulated according to that frame. So that's quite complex, I would argue. Another attempt to understand what is happening relates back to a much more historical framework. And we all know the stories of some of the Greek mythology that tells us the story of Hermes and Aphrodite giving birth to a son, Hermaphroditus, a child of mixed sex. And the myth connects well with some of those theories from the ancient world and their medics and philosophers. Hippocrates, for example. He contended that whenever there is conception, two seeds fuse together to form a fetus. Both partners experiencing pleasure when having sex was seen as an evidence of them both emitting seed. Semen could only come from the whole body, and sex determination depended on the balance of strong male semen versus weak female semen. Or let's name Aristotle. For Aristotle, the male is the efficient cause of offspring. The female is, for him, just, the material cause. The male provides the soul of the embryo and the female the body. Sperm conveys spirit into the female, and semen bears the immaterial reason, which the woman receives, and reason is divine. Clearly, for him, women are constituted by a series of deficiencies. In their pregnancy, for example, pregnant women, according to Aristotle, did not have their periods because the developing fetus fed itself on the blood. Just a few hundred years later, Galen, a medic, shaped this approach further, even though he moved away from a two-seed theory, rejecting some of Aristotle's earlier ideas. I'm moving quick, and I'm aware of that. But this early conceptualization led, together with other social and material categories, to the understanding that there is only one singular spectrum of male and female, only one sex related to power, virtue, status, and temperature. It was duritia, in Latin, hardness, muscularity of the ideal male body, versus mollitia, softness, delicateness, emotions. Women were seen as imperfect men, imperfect versions of the male body. It doesn't take a lot of effort to understand how this one-sex theory and its default male body had its influence on the New Testament world, and well beyond that, into the first centuries. Until the very late 1700s, there is a strong evidence that this one-sex theory, with the view that men and women have the same reproductive equipment, was very strongly present. Growing anatomic and physiological knowledge changed the perspective, as the one-sex model was no longer compatible with anatomical complexity. So between 1650 and 1850, we see a gradual transition into a two-sex model. Social, intellectual, and also theological changes led to the arrival of the two-sex model, while in some areas of society, like in the church, the one-sex model still exercises its influence in liturgy and church leadership. So we embarked on this brief excursion for the sake of finding wisdom for a young couple in our imaginary story. How do our reflections through those various lenses offered support us in our journey with the young couple? Would it be possible for us to help the parents to see their child in a different perspective, while at the same time, not all problems would be solved. Imagine that we would not give them the advice to embark immediately, if at all possible, on a series of surgical interventions, but instead try to value the child as given by God, who transcends the uncultured binary gender categories. Would it be acceptable to help them see their child from this perspective? I'll leave behind some of the other conversations around gender essentialism and gender constructivism as two further lenses that could help us to identify what is really happening here. Basically, being essentialist, God has created man and woman in their essence, and therefore it's God's purpose that members of one sex desire to be members of the opposite sex. This cannot be changed. Or in the constructivist paradigm, everything is construed. Gender develops itself in social and historical constructs. The broader scientific discourse on our topic is also of interest. And before I conclude with some further theological reflections, I would like to just mention this. Neuroscientist Nina Rippon, contends that men and women are not that different. Above else, they learn gender, she contends. She does not disrespect classical theory, nature-nurture models, but points out to the plasticity of the brain. It changes under the influence of experience people have. An example, in order to be eligible for a permit to drive a taxi in London, potential drivers need to prove that they mastered the city's street map. Research showed that the brain of those who are still trainees differed substantially from those who had been on the job for years. The brain seems much more proactive and in fact anticipating in more ways regarding the collection of information than previously thought. One would think that the brain responds to new data arriving, while in fact the brain seems to generate predictions about what could come next, based on previous patterns in earlier situations. So Rippon contends that the brain is producing a constant collection of images that helps us to navigate. The brain therefore functions as a predictive satellite navigation. Rippon emphasizes the high-level interaction between predisposition and context. A world in which gender and its related opinions are central will develop a human brain that functions on the basis of predominant discourses. Ruling ideas and discourses about what is normative for masculine or feminine behavior will leave their traces in the human brain. So neat binary distinctiveness of these labels is being challenged. And something that is written in our genes may come to express itself in different contexts. It's time to return to theology. I'm sorry for the excursus into neuroscience. Sarah Coakley, among many others, insists that we need to think deeply about the foundations of faith in God, as she states that the right speech of God, contemplation of God, and ordering of desire all hang together. And I'm referring to Sarah Coakley because I'm after a certain language that we could start to use to deal differently with, let's say, developing hopeful practices around gender and sexuality. God should be at the center of things whenever we reflect on desire. She initiates a way of thinking about the Trinity that seeks to enable a different approach to gender and sexuality. Her aim is to develop a vision of the self that defines our identities based on a deep participation in God's love, as shown to us by the triune God. So this transformation of the self leads to what she calls a radical purification of wrongly oriented desires. Desire, in this vision, is the determining factor that makes me human. And she proposes to subordinate the thinking about gender to to thinking about desire. Gender is about the differentiated and embodied relationship of a person to God and others. So they both are in need for completion and final transformation. Coakley, I quote, she says, gender may be seen not merely as a locus of oppression, but just as much as the potential vehicle of embodied salvation. Gender, embodied difference, is here not to be eradicated, note, but to be transformed. It still matters, but only because God desires it to matter. and can remake it in the image of his Son. So this transformative character of the triune God needs to influence our gender conversations. It's the interrupting activity of the Spirit that is fundamental for our understanding of that. God, in his plurality of love, breaks right through predominant binary thinking. I end with a quote there from Sarah Coakley. So this irreducible threeness in God cannot be insignificant for the matter of gender two-ness, since the human is precisely made in God's Trinitarian image and destined to restore to that image, to be restored to that image. It must be then that in this fallen world one lives in some sense between two-ness and its transfiguring interruption. So one is not, as in secular gender theory, endlessly and ever subject to the debilitating falseness of fallen gender, fallen two-ness. In fact, in Christ, I meet a human who precisely in the Spirit has effected that interruptive presence and transfiguration of two-ness. He has done so by crossing the boundary between another two-ness, more fundamental even than the two-ness of gender, the ontological two-ness of the transcendent God and the created world. Questions remain. Not all questions are answered, but that was not the idea for tonight. It was about testing ideas. It was about sharing them with you. I would like to end with some acknowledgements. I have dedicated this lecture to my grandfather, Siebe de Groot, who was in so many ways of influence on my theology, as you heard about. He was truly a man of God and a theologian in his own right, even though I disagreed strongly with him on many cases. A special word of thanks goes to Reverend Dr. Anne Malaby. She could not be here tonight, unfortunately, our former Whitley College academic dean. And you have been really one of the great supporters of this project today. And I thank you for your support. And I know that you're looking at this at this very moment. And I also want to thank you, Richard, Anne's husband, Richard Malaby, for his genuine friendship and also collegiality. In the process, our children, Christian, Marike, Ariane, Rosie, and their partners have been asking the right questions and encouraged me to finish as well. And it is not a secret that while I was writing this lecture, René Erwich was finishing his PhD project on the Psalms. And on the 7th of January, I'm already a proud father, but even on the 7th of January, we're even more proud of him as he defends the project and his dissertation. I'm looking forward to write together with him soon. I also mention you, Krista, love of my life, and I thank you for your never-ending support and love, and for the fact that you are here. And finally, I would like to honor and thank my colleagues at Whitley College. And I look at you as you are here. Your influence can easily be found back in this text. That's not so difficult. And I thank you for your support. I thank you for your influence. I thank you for your excellence in research and theological education. And I also include in this a big thank you for the Whitley College Council. Peter, I see that you are here, and I thank you as a representative, as the chair of the Whitley Council. It's a great joy to work together. And also a special word of thanks to Reverend Katrina Lambert, who was willing to steer me a bit in the right direction at some points with this lecture. And you were willing to read drafts and help me to construct the right stuff. Thank you for doing that. I finally really end with the words of St. Augustine in his sermon on Matthew 11, 28 to 30, where Matthew writes the words of Jesus, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." The repetitive question Augustine formulates in his sermon on Jesus' invitation is, Lord, what is it that we can learn? Augustine draws us into a posture of learning. And whenever I theologize, I'm aware of one thing, more needed than anything else that I've said tonight. And that is what I hope to learn, the unforced rhythms of grace, to be gentle, to be compassionate, and to be humble of heart. So I quote Augustine, "What are we to learn from you, Lord? Stretch out the sky, fix the earth, pour out the sea, spread the air around, fill all the elements with the appropriate animals, arrange the ages, rotate the seasons. Is that what you want to teach us? Or would you perhaps want us to learn how to do what you did on earth? Is that what you want us to teach? Is that what you want to teach us? We can then learn from you how to cleanse lepers, drive out demons, chase fever away, command the sea and the waves and raise the dead?" Nothing like that at all, he says. But what then, Lord? Gentleness and humbleness of heart. May this be your posture of learning. Gentleness and humbleness of heart. Thank you for your attention.
Colleagues, it's my pleasure to say a word of thanks and congratulations to René and to make a small presentation to introduce you to the University's Chancellor, Dr. Graham Blackman.
Thank you, Vice-Chancellor, and René, this is a great joy to be here with your family and friends and international colleagues, and you have really challenged and stimulated us tonight, so I appreciate that. What I would like to do is read the citation for Professor Erwich and then hand to René the copy of his testama that he can happily hang somewhere and confirm his appointment. So Professor René Erwich is an internationally recognised expert in Christian theology and ministry and its application to contemporary society. His research involves a hopeful articulation of Christian faith in engagement with the needs and challenges of secular society. He has been the recipient of several major grants for applied and collaborative research, including projects on spiritual leadership in a post-Christian society and Christian identity in healthcare. Professor Erwich is also widely recognised for his teaching in pastoral theology and missiology. Scholarly appreciation of his work has led to numerous guest lectureships and conference presentations in many parts of the world. He has rendered significant leadership to the Church and Academy as research professor in theology at the Eid Christian University in the Netherlands, and since 2017 as principal of Whitley College. Professor René Erwich.
Thank you.
Colleagues and friends, that concludes the formal proceedings for tonight. Thank you very much for your presence with us, and may the